Detroit, Michigan. On the desk, a medical report reads, Session number 3. Patient, Richard Williams, age 27 years, condition, dementia, mythomania. Richard, we are starting the 3rd session. As you remember, in previous sessions, we talked about your childhood and the things you feel have been important to you. However, from now on, I want us to focus on the moments that have marked your last 2 years. As always, I want you to know that I am recording these sessions for professional use. Ethically, nothing you say will be exposed.
I hope you understand that it's not easy for me to talk about this. They accused me of homicide for acts I didn't commit.
I know, Richard, but let's not talk about the consequences. I want us to talk about what happened. I know it's painful for you, but I'm here to help you, which is why I need you to be as precise as possible with your account.
All right, I'd like to start with the most recent event. This happened less than a year ago, in October. I went to Comerica Park to see Miguel Cabrera's farewell from baseball. The Detroit Tigers were playing against the Cleveland Guardians. I went with my brother Jaden and several friends. That day, the stadium was packed with fans. I remember the amazing atmosphere. The Detroit Tigers won 5-2, and despite the season not being the best, it was the farewell of a legend. You could feel the joy and nostalgia in the air. We stayed until the end, but when we left the stadium to take the bus, I got lost in the crowd. I couldn't find my brother or my friends, so I decided to step aside to call him. By mistake, I entered an alley. I say by mistake because I never thought that decision would end in tragedy. I took out my phone to call my brother, and while doing so, I heard noises at the end of the alley. Something moving among the trash. I thought it could be a homeless person or rats, but at one point I heard something calling my name. Richard. It was like a faint whisper, but I heard it clearly. With the phone in my hand, I decided to turn on the flashlight, and at that moment, the noise stopped. I didn't approach any further. With my back to the alley, I heard the voice again saying my name. Richard. I turned around and, please, Mr. Charles, I hope you understand that what I'm going to tell you happened.
I'm not here to judge you. Tell me what you need to tell.
What I saw was a goblin or a small devil. I'm not really sure. It looked me in the eyes and smiled. Its body was almost completely naked. Its reddish skin looked like it was painted with blood, and its face was diabolical with a big beard. I could only look at it for a few seconds before a group of drunk people entered the alley. Instantly, I turned around, and without saying a word, these people surrounded me. There were 4 of them. I immediately realized I was in trouble. They took the phone from my hand and asked if I was lost in the alley. They were thieves. One of them lifted his shirt to show me a weapon. I told them I had no problem giving them what I had, but they were drunk enough that it didn't satisfy them. At that moment, my brother entered the alley shouting, "Hey Richard, everything all right?" Instantly, the thieves turned around, and my brother understood everything. He approached me while the thieves said, "Great, let's gather the family." My brother, who is hot-blooded, confronted one of the thieves. Instantly, one of them immobilized me and pulled out his gun, threatening to shoot my brother. But the adrenaline was too much, so my brother punched one of the thieves in the face. The one with the weapon didn't hesitate and shot my brother directly in the heart. A fatal shot that made my brother fall to his knees. I couldn't believe it. The thief took the revolver and hit me on the head. I don't know how long I was unconscious, but a police officer woke me up. I had the weapon they used to shoot my brother in my hand. I spent the night at the police station. The incident was being investigated, but the truth is that, except for what they found, there was no evidence that it had been a dispute between my brother and me. They considered the homicide option as the most logical. I didn't hesitate to tell them about the goblin, but that story didn't move them. In fact, they subjected me to drug tests and investigated my background. Unfortunately, this isn't the first time such a misfortune has happened to me.
I understand, and I think we should pause for a moment before proceeding. I believe this story has been difficult for you. You could see it in Richard, who was sweating considerably. Outside, a storm could be seen through the office window. The clock read 6:05 p.m. Richard nodded, took a glass of water from a table beside him, and drank slowly. I took the opportunity to make some notes. When I finished, I said, "If you want, we can continue in a new session, no problem." Richard showed his appreciation with a nod. The truth is that this particular case kept my attention. Being with Richard, knowing his history, listening to his stories firsthand, was a fascinating experience. Knowing that the final report I would issue from these sessions would be relevant to the case made me spend many hours analyzing Richard's gestures, constantly listening to the session recordings to evaluate his tone of voice, which sometimes was cold and calculating. But at the same time, talking to him was no different from having a conversation with any other person or friend. It's hard not to think that you might be facing a criminal or a simple innocent person who is paying for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. For the next session, the fourth, I decided to let Richard choose the time. In this case, he chose a bit later, after 7 in the evening. This session took place 3 days later, on a Thursday. As always, Richard was punctual and greeted me upon arrival. Already familiar with the protocol, he sat on the couch to begin the session. He seemed calm, but as in the previous sessions, the really interesting part happened when he started recounting the events. Well, Richard, welcome again. This is the fourth session. Just like the previous one, I want us to talk more about the events that have happened in the last 2 years. As always, I remind you that this session is being recorded as professional evidence. I hadn't finished speaking when Richard began his story.
Mr. Charles, I would like to talk today about an incident that I know is relevant to my case. Again, I ask you for patience because it is not easy to talk about this, but I will try to be as precise as possible.
Please proceed and take your time.
There is one night that has particularly marked my life. We're talking about December 2022, a little before Christmas, on the 17th. It was a Saturday night, my friends went out partying and I decided to stay home. However, I spent the night checking Instagram, seeing my friends post about how much fun they were having. I felt a bit jealous, I'm not going to lie. But that night, I preferred to stay home and watch movies until late. That day was different. At the time, I lived with my brother in a house in the Dearborn Heights area. Our parents separated when we were young, and as adults, we decided it was a good idea for our mom to live with us. It was a fairly safe residential area, despite Detroit's reputation. As I mentioned, that night I stayed home, but my brother went out. My mom stayed up until around 11 at night watching TV in the living room before going to bed. On Sundays, we usually go to Mass in the morning, mostly for our mother. I remember that night I went upstairs to get some water. My favorite space in the house was the basement, which we had turned into a man cave. When I went up, I noticed a strong smell of trash in the kitchen. And yes, my brother had forgotten to take out the trash before leaving. I walked to the front door and heard noises coming from the front of the house. Many times these noises are made by raccoons or wild animals, but this time it was different. It sounded like someone was trying to enter the house. I calmly approached the window next to the door, but could only see darkness. I didn't expect anything surprising, so I decided to go out to take out the trash. When I was outside, I noticed the night was particularly cold. I walked to the trash can, and something made me stop in my tracks. The streetlight faintly illuminated the tree in front of my house, and there, 2 large eyes shone in the darkness. For a moment, I thought it was a cat or a raccoon, but this was bigger than that. It moved slowly toward the light, revealing a body that gleamed a reddish color like blood. It was a red goblin, like a devil, half naked and demonic eyes. I was in shock for a few seconds, quickly dropped the trash in the yard, and ran to the house, leaving the door open. I stood before the door and looked back to see if the goblin was still there, but it was gone. I entered the house and immediately noticed a strong burning smell. Smoke was coming from the stairs. I couldn't understand what was happening, but the stairs had turned into an oven of flames that roared, enormous flames that made no sense. I quickly called 911 to report the emergency, while realizing my mother was sleeping in her room. Or was she? I didn't really know. I abandoned the house, consumed by fire. The neighbors quickly became aware of the fire and gathered in front of my house, asking if there was anyone inside, but I didn't know. I was in shock. Words wouldn't come out of my mouth. The firefighters took 20 minutes to arrive. They did their best, but there was nothing to save. At almost the same time, my brother arrived. I'd called him desperately after contacting emergency services. Outside the house, there were firefighters, ambulances, and police officers, all doing their jobs while we watched, unable to stop thinking that our mother had died in the cruelest way, asleep, consumed by the flames. It was devastating to live through that moment of helplessness and confusion. After weeks of investigation, the firefighters determined it had been a failure in the heating system. A spark caused the fire that quickly spread from the top of the house to the bottom. The house was on fire while I went out to take out the trash. It had been just a moment. In my statement to the police, I made it clear what I had seen, but where could I get evidence or a logical explanation for what I had seen?
This goblin torments you. I hear you and could think it's an invention of your mind as a consequence of both shocks, but from how you describe it, it's real. Do you see it often? Do you still see it?
I'm sure it exists. I can't prove it, but I've seen it several times. It haunts me in the most intense tragedies I've lived through.
I think that's enough for today. We still have more sessions, and I know you have more to tell me, but these stories, I need to make some notes. The best thing is for you to rest, Richard. We'll meet again in a few days.
That sounds good. We'll talk more later, Mr. Charles. I just ask you to believe me. This is real. I know the police consider me a madman, but it's real. I'm not a criminal.
No one has decreed that you are a criminal. We'll meet in the next session to continue. Shall we say next Sunday at the same time?
That sounds good.
As soon as Richard left my office, I noticed his exhaustion was greater than in the previous session. He was becoming more consumed each time. It couldn't be easy for him to talk about these things. He lost his mother and brother in less than 2 years, but his story remained strange. That goblin with a devil's body he talked about so much. I knew firsthand that the authorities considered him a murderer. His story was seen as bizarre, and there was even a theory that he was possessed by some sort of demon making him act that way. I made my notes, but this time it was difficult. I felt exhausted from being involved in this case. At one point, I lay on the couch and played the role of Richard. I closed my eyes and visualized the goblin talking to me, telling me that yes, he had caused all those crimes. Maybe I wanted to believe Richard, but it was hard to give validity to a goblin. I even imagined the goblin or demon to the point that I was trying to draw it in my notebook. Honestly, this case was taking a toll on me. So much so that I decided to leave everything aside until my next session with Richard. Even he could notice my physical and emotional exhaustion. He pointed it out to me before starting the next session.
Mr. Charles, are you okay? You look tired. Are you sleeping well?
I'm fine, Richard. Thank you for asking, but don't worry. I wanted to tell you that I have decided this will be our last session, so it's important that we discuss the details of the car accident mentioned in your record. I understand it happened about 2 or 3 months after the house fire. Richard realized that his case was consuming me.
I understand, Mr. Charles. I just hope this doesn't lead you to make a wrong evaluation of what we've talked about. I've been honest with you, and I hope for the same in return.
I'm a professional, Richard. The judge has asked me to advance with the report, so we need to speed up the process. And don't worry, I will be fair with you as I am with all my patients. Richard sat on the couch, took a sip of the water glass I always placed for my patients, and began.
Okay, Mr. Charles. Indeed, this accident you're talking about happened exactly 3 months after my mother's death. I was driving toward downtown on Michigan Avenue. It was a bit late at night. I was going to meet some friends at a bar. At that hour, many trucks are driving about, so you have to be very attentive to the road. I was, but again, I must emphasize this happened. I was listening to music on the radio, and at one point I noticed a silhouette in the back seat. I saw it through the rearview mirror. I was alone in the car, but again, those demonic eyes looked at me through the mirror. I swear, it was the reddish goblin, that demon that haunts my nightmares. It looked at me with conviction, and then it smiled. Everything happened very quickly then. In a second, my car crashed into a huge truck, and I lost control. It happened in just a few seconds, but for me, it felt like an eternity. The truck crashed directly into the safety barrier and overturned. I got out of the car and went straight to the truck. Just looking at the state of the truck, I knew it was serious. I called 911 to report the crash. The firefighters had to cut the truck doors. Undoubtedly, the driver had died in the accident. And again, I found myself involved in another accident where someone died. The police took my statements, conducted a breathalyzer test, and tested me for drug use. All negative. And of course, I didn't hesitate to mention the goblin I saw again. Was I going crazy?
Calm down, Richard. I understand your frustration. I began to notice how this story significantly altered Richard. So, I decided this session would be shorter. I had everything I needed. I had Richard's statements to the police, which shouldn't have altered my judgment. But the truth was, I was increasingly uncomfortable being with him and having these sessions of sincerity. The case was really consuming me. I dedicated the last few minutes of the session to discussing other topics to avoid talking about the crimes. We talked about his jobs, studies, and relationships, details that weren't minor but seemed too common compared to these 3 particular incidents. It was like listening to stories of other people in the life of someone who had nothing to do with them. That same night, after Richard left my office, I decided to dedicate my last efforts to the final report. I thought a lot about the words I would use. I wanted to be careful with the language, but even for an experienced professional like me, who has had so many years in my field, it was difficult to give credit to a goblin who caused tragedies. I couldn't defend a person by assuming the existence of a demon controlling the fate of its victims. I stayed up late reading the report over and over until I felt the fatigue overtaking me. It was around 1:30 a.m. when I turned off the office lights and took the elevator down to level S1 where my car was parked. However, when the elevator doors opened, the parking lot lights were off. I froze for a moment. Despite the hour, the parking lot lights usually stayed on. I got out of the elevator and the lights flickered. At the end of the parking lot, I saw a silhouette. I thought it was a building security guard, but the lights flickered again, and what was at the end of the parking lot was definitely not recognizable to my eyes. I felt anxiety coursing through my body. I couldn't breathe, and Richard's report fell from my hands to the floor. The lights flickered again, more frequently, and the silhouette moved closer to me. I heard the whisper in my head,
Charles.
And again,
Charles.
I was in a state of delirium, trying to move but paralyzed. The lights briefly came on, and in front of me appeared a grotesque smile on a reddish-skinned face I had imagined so many times. The one Richard had talked about, the one I had drawn in my notebook. The face was filled with hatred and madness. The eyes of the Nain Rouge had chosen me. I was his next victim.